All right, I'm just going to go ahead and start this module on economics and water quality standards. So my name is Gary Russo, if you don't already know. I'm in the Office of Water, headquarters, Office of Water, Office of Science and Technology, Standards and Health Protection Division, National Branch. And we're going to talk about what role economics might play in water quality standards. Okay, so we're going to start. Here's the infamous disclaimer. All right. Okay, so I'm going to start off with just a couple case examples. Actually, this is just things that really happened. This was a situation here. A state came to EPA with this situation here where there was a mercury aquatic life criterion of 1.3 parts per trillion, which was very low. And you know, as we talked about before, you know, one of the 101A2 uses is propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, but not just for their existence, for human consumption as well. So the state calculated a human health criterion, taking into consideration bioaccumulation of mercury, and mercury is very, or at least methylated mercury is very bioaccumulative. And so 1.3 parts per trillion was the ambient criteria that was necessary to meet that designated use. The problem with that is that was below the detection limit for mercury, at least at that time. This example actually occurred some time ago, so things may have changed, but at that time, it was below the detection limit, and the primary source of mercury was, as we all know, air deposition. And if you just look at the background levels of mercury in that state, it was 2 parts per trillion, so the whole state was impaired for mercury. And if you actually captured rain and measured mercury in there, it was 10 parts per trillion just in rainfall. And so I did this quick little calculation here. You know, how much would it cost, you know, to remove mercury from your effluent if you had a permit limit that was, you're in an impaired water, so your water quality-based effluent limit is going to be criteria at the end of the pipe, so 1.3 parts per trillion. And it costs about $10 million to $100 million per pound to remove mercury from the effluent. And from a cheapy little thermometer that you can still buy at Amazon, there's about 3 grams of mercury in there, and that would cost about $330,000 to remove that much mercury from the effluent. So, you know, that's a lot of money. And here's another case where a state said that there was a mining company that was not able to meet its effluent limits for cadmium, lead, and zinc, and that they calculated that the cost to meet their permit limit was $5.5 million. And you know, the mine lost money the previous year and is going to close if they have to meet this standard. It's the largest employer in town. They provide a large proportion of the tax revenue, jobs. Schools are going to suffer. And on top of that, 90% of the metals that are in stream are from other sources. And so even if they had to implement this control, that's going to bankrupt the mine, that it wouldn't even, the water body wouldn't attain its standard. So, you know, you may have seen claims like this or similar claims where, you know, people say meeting the water quality standard is too expensive. So can you do anything about that? And if so, what can you do? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I keep forgetting there's a screen back there. So the objectives of this module is to discuss, you know, where in the water quality standards process can economics be factored into decision making? What are the circumstances that those economic factors can be considered, And how do you do that? So EPA has some guidance, and as we discussed at the beginning of the course, guidance and policy is a could or should. It's not required. It's not a must or a shall. And the main guidance that we have is the Interim Economic Guidance for Water Quality Standards Workbook 1995. So that's a very focused guidance document on dealing with economic issues in water quality standards. There are other guidance documents that EPA has on conducting economic analyses, and I listed one example, Guidelines for Preparing Economic Analyses. It's a real thick book. Real economists use that to do regulatory impact analyses when they're are promulgating or promulgating a regulation. And it might be helpful in some situations, but basically the first one, the Interim Economic Guidance for Water Quality Standards Workbook 1995, I'm just going to refer to that as our 1995 guidance. That is by and large really what all you really need to know in this situation with water quality standards, and is what I'm going to be going through. I'm going to be just basically describing what our guidance, the 95 guidance, suggests as one possible way of evaluating the claims like I showed you at the beginning. And also want to say, so as guidance, it can be used. It shows what the kind of analysis, the analytical rigor that EPA believes will fulfill the requirements of the regulation, but it's by no means not the only way of doing things, and so there may be other ways states want to do things, or maybe more appropriate ways, because it can't, the guidance can't anticipate every possible scenario. So there's a lot of flexibility in the guidance. It's not a shall or a must, it's a should or a could. So what's the legal authority for even considering economics? Well, we saw this earlier at Section 101A. I pushed the wrong button, okay. That the objective of the act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. But then in 101A2, this interim goal, it's a national goal that wherever attainable, an interim goal of water quality which provides for the propagation and protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and provides recreation in and on the water be achieved by July 1st, 1983. So it's this wherever attainable that implies that it's not always going to be that although the expectation is that where water quality is going to be improving as a result of the act, it may not be feasible to attain that level of water quality everywhere all the time immediately. So this is where in the act we interpret the feasibility of attaining water quality standards can be taken into account. So where in the water quality standards process can you do that? So there's three areas. One is in the designated uses, you recall that you can lower or remove, well, I'll get into it actually in a minute, but I'll just say designated uses. In water quality standards variances, you can adopt a variance on the basis of economic considerations, and also in anti-degradation requirements. And I'll elaborate on that right now. So in lowering or removing a designated use, so this is 131.10G in the regulations that specify the requirements for wanting to remove or lower or remove a designated use, and that for 101A2 uses, you have to fulfill one of these 6 factors that are listed in there, and factor number six is the controls more stringent than those required by sections 301B and 306 of the Act, which are basically the technology-based effluent limits. So you have to, no matter what, if you're a permittee, you have to fulfill those requirements. But anything in addition to that, that would result in substantial and widespread economic and social impact. So that's one area where the regulation spells out economics can be considered. Another area is in water quality standards variances, and the 131.14 regulations say that you remember that there's three sections. There's what needs to be in the variance, the supporting A, and B, the supporting documentation that you have to provide EPA, and C, how variances are implemented. And in B, in the requirements for that submission and the supporting documentation, 131.14 requires that you include documentation demonstrating the need for the variance, and that has to be either for 101A2 use, one of the factors listed in 131.10G, which is one of those factors is factor 6, or for a non-101A2 use, consideration of the use and value of the water. And then finally, in anti-degradation requirements, and we, Manjali talked about this a few days ago. There's this 131.12, where the quality of water exceeds levels necessary to support the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife and recreation in and on the water. That quality shall be maintained and protected unless the state finds that allowing lower water quality is necessary to accommodate important economic and social development in the area in which the waters are located. So that's the regulatory basis for allowing economic considerations in water quality standards. Okay, so now I'm going to dissect. I'm going to simplify those concepts and then dissect them out into their component parts. The anti-degradation regulations talk about important economic or social development, and the 131.10G 6 factor talks about substantial and widespread economic and social impacts. For the purposes of determining, whether or not some scenario meets that regulatory threshold, EPA believes it's an acceptable practice to basically say that the same analytical process can be used to show those same conditions. So basically, I'm going to say substantial and widespread economic and social impacts for the rest of this talk, but it also applies to important economic or social development in an anti-degradation review. So we're going to simplify things by just saying it's basically the same concept, and we're going to look at an analytical process that will determine whether or not that exists. Okay, so substantial and widespread economic and social impacts. Well, what does that mean? Well, there's two parts to it. There's the substantial, and then there's the widespread part. Substantial impact is where the polluting entity would face a substantial financial impact due to the cost of the necessary pollution control. A substantial impact, another way of saying it's not affordable. And the guidance that I'm going to be going through in a few minutes is going to provide some tools to determine whether or not something is affordable or not. Widespread is that the affected community will bear, the entire community will bear a widespread adverse impact if the entity is required to meet those standards. So basically what this is saying is that there's two parts to it. One is that the cost has to be substantial, has to be unaffordable, and that it has to be widespread. That it's not just both of those conditions have to be met. And for a public entity, it's not as difficult to make the case for both substantial and widespread, but it's a little more complicated for a private entity. So and I'll get into this in a little bit more detail later, but just for now, an example would be if there's a facility with a permit that cannot comply with its permit limit, and it can show that meeting the standard, meeting its permit limit would result in a substantial impact, and it would result in a closure of that facility. That alone is not sufficient to meet the regulatory requirement of substantial and widespread. That closure has to have a widespread effect on the overall community. After all, water is a public resource, and so it's only fair that that impact is that if water quality is going to be degraded in some way, that the public has some say in that process, and not just the owner of that facility. Okay, so practically speaking, what generally happens is that some entity, usually a discharger, petitions the state for some relief. They cannot meet their QBEL, and they ask the state for some relief, either a variance or a use change, or they want to further degrade water quality in their anti-degradation review. And so they petition the state, and the state makes decisions and on what action to take with public input. And together, then, with the public input, and the state decides whether or not they want to take some action, and then that action is, and this is a water quality standards kind of centric slide. For water quality standards, if the action is a water quality standard, they submit it to EPA for review and approval or disapproval. In the case of anti-degradation review, permits aren't submitted to EPA necessarily for review and approval, but EPA can object to a permit. So there's a role for EPA as well. Okay, so the 1995 guidance provides an analytical structure for helping determine whether or not a cost of meeting a standard would result in substantial and widespread economic and social impact. And the guidance divides it up into private entities and public entities. And it's, this is an important distinction because the financial indicators are different. But the analytical process is more or less the same. So first, you estimate the cost of the pollution control that would be necessary to meet the standard. And then you determine, okay, would that additional cost have a substantial impact on the entity? And if it does have a substantial impact on the entity, then you have to determine whether that substantial impact is widespread. And if that is, if the analysis shows yes, in fact, it would be widespread, then there's the question of, so it answers the question of can I, but it also, this analytical process answers the question of how much. So for example, we talked about, when you lower or remove a designated use, you don't just remove the use, you have to adopt the highest attainable use. When you adopt a variance, you don't just, lose all, it doesn't just remove the effluent limit for that parameter, you have the highest attainable condition. And in an anti-degradation review, you have to adopt one of the less degrading alternatives. So the same is the public entities and private entities basically It's the same process. For the public entities, it's a little more complicated because the public entity, basically, the public owns it, so the substantial impact affects the public. So you have to determine who that public is, and so there's an intervening step here on defining who the affected community is. And usually the public entities we're talking about are POTWs. And there's a couple exceptions, but 99% of the time it's a POTW. And then you determine if the impact is substantial, and our guidance provides a suggestion to that you may want to not go through the entire process right away, but just kind of get a sense for whether or not what we're really talking about here is the potential for a substantial impact. And so our guidance provides what we call a municipal preliminary screener. And so it's basically, it's like a one-step process to determine whether or not it's looking like there could be a substantial impact. If not, you may not want to continue on with the whole analytical process. If it does suggest an impact, then you may want to actually continue on with the whole process. And by the way, this analytical process is exactly, this is a 1995 guidance, it's exactly the same as the 1997 combined sewer overflow financial capability assessment guidance. It's exactly the same. Plagiarism. It is a beautiful thing. Well, why reinvent the wheel? So now, assuming that you have this substantial impact, you do this municipal preliminary screener, and then you do these secondary tests, and it suggests substantial impacts. You determine if the impact is widespread, and then again, it answers the question: can you get relief from the standard, and if so, how much? So I'm just going to go through the public entity analysis first, and I'll briefly touch on the private entity analysis. And I'm not going to go through all of the details, but I'm just going to basically kind of outline what the steps are. So the first step is to estimate the costs, I mentioned before. And so, there are some points that EPA believes are the minimum necessary requirements to meet the requirement of the regulation in terms of determining the project costs. You're estimating the cost of the pollution controls that would be necessary to meet the standard. A credible engineering analysis, not some, my cousin told me, or something like that, but actual, a real evaluation of the technology that's needed and how much it would cost. And there's different levels of cost estimates. Level 1 through 5, 1 being like exact, and level 5 being like kind of just a lot of uncertainty. The highest level of engineering analysis that you can provide, the more defensible the demonstration is going to be. And really, what this is all about is the defensibility of the demonstration. So, EPA is not trying to micromanage and prescribe exactly how states do things. What we're trying to do is ensure that our action is defensible. So the more when we get sued on an action, this demonstration that's provided is the record that we use to defend our action. So the stronger the demonstration that states provide EPA in their submission, the stronger our defense is going to be against any legal challenge. So only those controls needed to meet the standard. A lot of times, you're upgrading a wastewater treatment plant, and you're like, well, we're growing, and we probably should increase our capacity. So let's kind of roll everything together in the same project. That's okay, but in terms of determining whether or not you can get relief from the water quality standard, is only that part of the cost that's necessary to meet the standard, not because you're anticipating future growth. A broad range and combination of cost-effective options. it's unacceptable to say, oh, we have a 10 million gallon per day POTW, and it's going to cost this much money to run that through reverse osmosis, and so we can't meet the standard. Well, there could be other options available that's short of reverse osmosis, that's be less expensive, that could meet the standard. So, show that as well, and use the lowest cost method to evaluate the potential impacts, and include adequate documentation. Again, it's about establishing a record. Okay, define the affected community. So our guidance suggests that for looking at a public entity, especially a POTW, usually it's by household because the bills are usually to a household. So you need to determine where those households are. What's the service area of that POTW? Who's paying the bills? And how many of them there are. So you define the affected community. I basically just said that. And this last one too here, consider proportion of cost burden for different users. So there are some situations where there are indirect industrial discharges to a POTW. They're paying, presumably, for the privilege of discharging to the POTW as well. So if that's a significant contribution to the revenue stream of the POTW, you should consider that as well.
I had a question on this. So thinking about this is who's paying, it's kind of easy to figure that out, but who is the, I guess the social benefit though could be a larger community. Is that part of the, because water quality standards not meeting the original standard could have a negative impact on these users as well as many other users downstream. So I was kind of thinking about community could be really big or smaller. So are we looking at only who's paying for the community that's affected?
In terms of determining substantial and widespread, yes. Okay. But lowering a designated use or variance, those are not mandatory actions. Those are optional. So that's part of the state process. When the public comes in and has a say over what there may be a decision where there is a substantial and widespread impact, but you decide that's something that you're willing to accept because downstream water quality may be affected, or there may be some other benefits that would be degraded. So now we're in the substantial part, determine whether or not the impact is substantial. And so the guidance suggests this municipal preliminary screener. And so basically it's the average annualized cost per household divided by the median household income. So you take the median household income of the service area, then you divide the cost up. You say, okay, well the cost is $10 million, I'm just making this up, to upgrade this plant. You divide that up by household, and then you convert that into a percent of median household income. And EPA provides some benchmarks to use. This is not hard and fast, but basically, the EPA believes that if the cost of wastewater treatment after the upgrade, total cost, including what was happening before, is less than 1%, it's probably a small impact. You're likely not to show substantial and widespread impacts. If it's greater than 2%, there's a good chance that there may be a substantial and widespread impact, so you may want to continue on. And if between 1% and 2% of median household income is a gray area, you may or may not want to continue on. So this is just a way to make a decision whether or not you want to continue on this analytical approach. So let's assume that your municipal preliminary screener was close to 2% or over 2%. You say, okay, I think there's going to be substantial impact. Let's go on to the whole analysis. And so you apply these secondary tests that the guidance suggests. And so basically, there's 2 debt indicators. So these are socioeconomic indicators. Basically, what is the financial health of the community that is going to have to bear the cost of this pollution control upgrade. And there's two debt indicators, which are the bond rating and the overall net debt of the community. There's two socioeconomic indicators, which is the unemployment rate and the median household income. And then there's two financial management indicators, which is the property tax revenues and the property tax collection rate. And so our guidance makes some suggestions on how to score those indicators into either a 1, which means it's a weak economic conditions, 2, which is mid-range, and 3, which are strong. And then you calculate the average score. So let me just show you that here in a second. So these are those 6, the 2 debt, the 2 socioeconomic, and the 2 financial management indicators. And this is the actual indicator, so it's the bond rating, and which determines the credit worthiness of the community. Usually, municipalities, they finance these projects through some kind of debt instrument. And the guidance provides some benchmarks for how to score the bond rating. You know, it's like BB and above is a 1, or something like this, and B minus is 2. I can't remember exactly what they are, but you take the bond rating, and the guidance shows you a way to score them as a 1 or 2 or 3. This overall net debt as a percent of market value of taxable property, which is another way of characterizing the current debt burden on the residents of the community they're going to have to pay. Then the socioeconomic indicators, the unemployment rate. The guidance provides a way to score that relative to the state average, and the median household income relative to, I think the unemployment rate compared to the national average, the median household income compared to the state average. But basically, it's a way of determining, the general economic health and spending capacity of that community. And then there's 2 financial management indicators: property tax revenue divided by the market value of taxable property, and the property tax collection rate. So basically, the capacity to support additional debt and how well the local government is administered. These statistics, median household income, unemployment rate, you can find that from the Census Bureau website. And these other statistics, like property tax revenue, market value of taxable property, those are in the annual financial statements of these communities. Oftentimes nowadays you can find them on the website. If it's not on a website, you can call the local government office and ask them, and they'll tell you. It's all public information. It's not that hard to obtain that information. So the guidance suggests you score those 6 indicators, and I just made these up. So just as an example, we took those financial statistics, we scored them according to the way the guidance suggests. We came up with these scores, and now you take the average, add them all together and divide by 6, and that's an average. And then there is the substantial impacts matrix. So basically what the guidance suggests is you have your secondary score here along the y-axis, kind of y-axis-y, and then this is the municipal preliminary screener along the x-axis. And what you see here is that, so if the secondary indicators show a strong economy and the cost is very low compared to the median household income, so you're kind of in this corner of the matrix, the result is not likely to be substantial. And in the opposite end, if the costs are greater than 2% median household income and you're in a weak economy here, then you're likely to have a substantial impact. And you can see here, there's this gray area where the impacts are unclear. That does not necessarily mean you have to stop. A lot of times, some entities say, we're in one of these gray areas, but we believe that it's still a substantial impact. That's okay. Just explain how. It's possible that maybe some of the indicators didn't accurately capture some of the economic conditions in your community. There are other extenuating circumstances that are not captured in our guidance. It's just explain. How if you end up in this unclear area here, what are the extenuating circumstances where you conclude that the analysis shows a substantial impact?
I don't have a mic, right? I hope I'm loud enough. When you calculate all this, is it at a specific time? Is it spread over a span of, say, a number of years? Because then you need a rate of inflation, kind of thing.
You're trying to anticipate the future here. So these costs are costs that are going to occur in the future. And so you'd want to use the most recent economic information that you have.
So you're doing at time, like say, when you're submitting this at time T now, you're not saying, you're going to pay for all this over 5 years, 10 years.
You are well, usually, it depends on how the municipality pays for these projects. Usually it's over a 20-year period, that you finance it through some debt instrument. And so you're trying to determine whether or not, how viable the community is financially to be able to sustain that level of debt. Yeah.
So this slide is entitled "Evaluate Impact to the Discharger," but yet included, it seems to me, in these calculations are impacts to the community, financial impacts to the community. So that looks like a little bit, of a difference there. And so considering that, are there also, doesn't this need to be balanced with the, impacts to the community in terms of health impacts, from either drinking water or health impacts to the aquatic life? What are those costs when you do this evaluation, and is that part of the regulations for this?
That's not a regulatory requirement, but that is certainly something that the state could and should consider when deciding whether or not they want to allow this, the relief from water quality standards. And that's where the public process part comes in. So it does factor into it, but not necessarily in this analysis.
So I think I may have missed something here. Is this apply to all three anti-DEG, UAAs, and variances, or just the latter two?
Yeah, all
All three?
So this could be a way to determine whether or not a lowering of water quality is necessary for important social and economic development in the area where of the water.
Okay.
That anti-degradation, that unless part of the anti-degradation regulation.
Okay. I guess I don't really equate those things, the important economic or social development and substantial and widespread impacts. So I guess I think of the latter as more of a negative impact, where you might want to have some anti-DEG to promote housing development or something like that, where it'd be improving, like an economic opportunity.
Well, right. So you wouldn't be calculating the economic, or the important economic and social development. What you're calculating here is the justification for allowing that economic and social development. So this would be the justification for it. So if you didn't if you didn't do that important economic and social development, you know, what would that basically cost in terms of not allowing?
So this would be for the alternatives analysis of
Yeah, well,
anti-deg?
yeah. So
Okay.
so there's two parts to it. One is, does the economic conditions justify allowing relief from the standard? And then the second part is, okay, well, if it does, then what is allowable? And so, for example, this analysis could play a role in looking at less degrading feasible alternatives and choosing which one you may want to implement in the anti-degradation world. In a variance world, it could factor into determining what is the highest attainable condition. So, so for a variance, you may want to do this analysis and say, okay, well, meeting the standard, you've got substantial widespread. Now you've got this next level of control, still substantial and widespread. Next level of control, still substantial widespread. Next level of control, no, we don't have substantial widespread. Okay, this is going to be our highest attainable, because by definition, it's not substantial and widespread, so it's attainable. Okay, so now, once you determine whether or not it's substantial, you have to justify whether actually that substantial impact is widespread. And this alludes to your question a little earlier about this, kind of, well, the public kind of overall pays for the pollution control, not the actual entity. And yes, that's true. I mean, and that's why it is somewhat an easier argument to make that a substantial impact to a publicly owned entity is widespread, because it's kind of implicit in the analysis here. When we're talking about the substantial impact, we're talking about the community as a whole. So by definition, it is widespread. But nonetheless, you have to meet the requirement of that regulation. And so in any documentation that you provide to demonstrate substantial and widespread impacts, you have to speak to the widespread impact. And so our guidance basically mentions, talks about basically your 3 steps. One is you define the effective community, which you already did in this substantial impact analysis, and you evaluate the community's current socioeconomic characteristics, and then you talk about the impact, that substantial impact, in terms of how the community's characteristics would change. And so now, up to now, we've got like numbers and indexes and we have a matrix. And when it comes to the widespread analysis, it's a little looser. And so it becomes a little more narrative. So what you might want to do is use some of these financial statistics to narratively make the case that this impact is widespread. Really, this is basically about gathering facts and telling a story. That's really what you're doing here. And so you just want to tell the story of how those substantial impacts would be widespread.
You've defined the community for purposes of substantial impact previously. Mm-hmm. Those are, I assume, generally the ratepayers of the utility. In terms of the community for the impacts, could you imagine a scenario where those are different communities?
Mm-hmm.
Can you go into that a little bit?
Well, just that if the community that's impacted is maybe more widespread than the community that is actually has to pay the costs, then you should consider that wider community and discuss how those impacts in this kind of smaller subset could potentially impact the wider community. Business activity, here, actually, next, there's some suggestions. Oh, I'm sorry. You can discuss, the unemployment rate, the number of, the households below poverty line, community development, business activity, social services, property values, tax revenues, you can discuss some of those economic conditions that could change to that surrounding community, even though they're not being directly impacted by increased rates.
So this has always kind of bothered me because, UAAs are sort of a permanent thing, right? But the basis for it, at least on this, are changeable, right? So the economy can go up, can go down. So I just wonder if you can address that.
Well, I mean, I think that speaks to the decision about whether or not you want to do a UAA. That's why a lot of states don't like doing UAAs, because, it is kind of, it's not really permanent. I mean, you're supposed to be looking at some of these, issues every 3 years, your triennial review. So you could always, adopt a designated use that was previously removed. It's the inertia is sometimes harder to make that happen.
In practice, it's a one-way ratchet.
Yeah, I know. And that's why we're pushing variances, because a variance is a temporary change. And so it really kind of keeps the designated use alive rather than basically giving up on it. I mean, there are some situations where, PCBs and, the Hudson River, I mean, they've been there 100 years and they're not going anywhere. And so you may want to consider, something more permanent. So I'm running out of time here. Let's, provide the supporting documentation. Basically what I said, you just want to tell a story, right? What you need to meet the standard, what it's going to cost, provide all your documentation, what the results are, your analytical results, how it's going to have an impact on the households, a substantial impact on the overall community, and just needs to be sound, reasonable, defensible, and documented. This is going to be the record that we have to defend our action. And state EPA cooperation throughout the process is encouraged. Of course, if you have any questions on how to do things, please, by all means, contact Terry. and I'm also available too. Okay, and then now you're at the end of the thing. Okay, so you can. Well, then there's how, if I can, how much? So for uses, it's what would be the highest attainable use. For variances would be a highest attainable condition, and for anti-degradation requirements, how much can I lower? How much would I be able to lower the water quality? And so you basically use the same analytical approach to look at the various different feasible different alternatives to determine what's feasible, and then you make a decision on that basis. I just wanted to mention a little bit about the private entity economic analysis. So now we're talking about businesses, private businesses. It's a little simpler in some ways, but in other ways it's a little more complicated. It's a little more complicated because the guidance suggests a different set of financial indicators and scoring them differently. But I also just want to reiterate that it's not just, well, it's going to cut into our profit margin. We can't do this. We're going to lower our profit. That's not acceptable. It has to be a substantial impact, and it has to impact the entire community.
I have a question about what you would call a local community in an area where maybe a large percentage of the people at any time on that particular piece of property are not actually from there.
Yeah, we've had that. That's an issue in a highly urbanized area where you've got even fairly large entity. And if they went out of business, well, there's 1 million people all around, and there's lots of other opportunities. That can be a challenge. And so if you encounter one of those, let us know.
I'm just saying about tourism. Areas where the large percentage of the people at any given time are not local residents.
Well, a loss of tourism revenue can be cited as one of the the economic.
Right, but it's not necessarily the community, it's the impact on business.
Well, but the business employs people in the community. So, and that's usually where the private entities go in terms of the widespread impact. So there, you actually have to look at the affected community specifically for that entity, and what would be the effect, on unemployment, on other, economic activity in the area. Just really wanted to quickly just go over the analytical process. I mean, I don't specify them here, but there's basically 4 different indicators. One is on profitability, so that you basically just measure the profit margin before and after. So you would look at your profit before, and then you would include this additional cost, and then you would calculate what your profit would be after, and you make those compare the two. And there's also these secondary indicators: liquidity, solvency, and leverage. The liquidity one, called the current ratios. So the guidance suggests you take the ratio of your current assets to your current liabilities, and it's a ratio. For solvency, it's a Beaver's ratio, cash on hand divided by total debt. And for leverage, it's the debt equity ratio, long-term debt divided by total equity. So all of these statistics are in a business's annual reports. I've heard a lot about, this is just so hard, we can't do this, Well, all these numbers are all readily available. Businesses calculate the current ratio and Beaver's ratio and debt equity ratio on a regular basis because they're trying to understand, how they're doing in relationship to their competition. So, their accountants are doing this all the time. There's no reason why they can't use this information for this analysis. And the other issue with the private entity analysis is that the EPA provides these benchmarks for, and I didn't show them to you, but for example, the unemployment, looking at the unemployment of the area, and the EPA suggests, you should compare current unemployment to the national average, and if it's so many percentage points above, you're good, or percentage points below, you're bad. The EPA guidance doesn't specifically provide those benchmarks because they're different depending on the business. And so, but there are these publications that provide these the kind of average, these kind of average benchmark ratios for a variety of different business sectors. And so the guidance suggests that you look them up, and you can get them at your public library. You find out what is the average ratio for your business sector, and then you would compare them to the ratio that you calculate for your business. And claims of confidentiality not acceptable. Sometimes some of this information a private entity might not want to share. You're submitting this, this action, to the state, and the state to EPA. It's by definition becomes public, and then some private entities don't like that. The EPA has a method to handle confidential business information. I mean, there's this tension between, public transparency and providing, discretion to private entities that don't want their private information, confidential information divulged. But the EPA has methods of doing that. They do it all the time when they develop effluent guidelines, and the federal EPA has that capability, and you may want to keep that in mind. The state, to make sure that the state has some way, if a situation like this arises where one of their dischargers has what they claim is confidential business information, that you can maintain that confidentiality and still provide the public transparency that's necessary to fulfill the public transparency component of the regulation.
I'm sorry, how would that really work in this case? Because you're actually asking for an exception or variance, let's say from a water quality standard. The public needs to be able to check your work. I would think that would be very hard to keep your information confidential. How does the EPA have a way to do that, work around this?
I think it depends on the situation and what information that the entity considers confidential. Whether or not it is actually confidential, there are regulations determining how do you identify confidential information.
Sure, and I understand that.
It's hard to give a kind of a blanket answer to that question, and it doesn't come up very often, but it has come up, and that's why I bring it up, is because there was a situation where a state has this sunshine law, and they're saying that the entity, everything that the entity submits to them has to be revealed to the public, and that kind of precludes them from applying for a variance, and it's kind of a tricky situation. It doesn't occur very often, but it's something to keep in mind. If you think that may be an issue, that there's some mechanism in place to handle it. And I just want to say something. Also, we have the Spreadsheet Tool. So the guidance has these kind of old-fashioned forms, in the old days with taxes. These forms and you fill all these things. Well, now we have these spreadsheets that basically you plug in all the data into the spreadsheets, and it just does all the calculations for you, and it even does that little substantial that little matrix thing for you. So it makes it a lot easier, and it makes it easier, especially when you're doing the kind of alternatives analysis. You basically can just plug in one cost, and then you can look at it on different spreadsheets. And the URL is in your materials. And so basically, regulations allow for economic considerations. Has to be both substantial and widespread. We've got guidance to help you. Guidance is not a must, it's a could. We're more than happy to help you, if you've got some, circumstances that require some special consideration. And, there's a question on.
Yes, I was trying to go through the supplemental materials. If you go back to saying, the URLs in these, where is it? I'm looking at the additional resources website list and so on and not seeing it.
Okay. If you Google the name of that guidance document, what is it called? Is that right? Or even if you do 1995 Interim Economic Guidance, Water Quality Standards, it'll come up with a page, and at the bottom of the page, there's 4 spreadsheets. And the spreadsheets actually, they're basically doing the same thing. They're just, there's the public and then there's the private entity spreadsheets, which are substantially different. But the anti-degradation and then the uses variances ones are basically the same. It's just the terminology is different. I just wanted to quickly just say, this here to go back to those case examples. So this was that Mercury example that I mentioned at the very beginning. So basically, what they did here, they actually didn't even use our economic guidance. They did this was a whole state. So this is they wanted to do a multiple discharge or variance for Mercury, and so they did this statewide economic model, and they showed that the costs, $1.3 billion per year, the number of jobs, tax, revenue reductions, and the minimal environmental benefit. They actually documented this all, and so they got a multiple discharge or variance where the highest attainable condition was the 12 parts per trillion human health criteria for drinking water, and that every entity would have to implement a pollution minimization program. Now, in the second case, in the mine, we looked into that, and actually it was a little surprising because we found when we looked at the numbers that they were including certain this kind of they allocated this $23.8 million amount of money for future environmental cleanup. So they actually didn't into this into this kind of profit loss statement, and so they really actually were operating at a profit, not a loss. And their financial indicators, if you look over the last 3 years, they were actually improving. They were doing pretty good. And we couldn't find any evidence that, there was no documentation that there was significant funding for for funding problems for the schools, and that the waters couldn't support the designated use. They just didn't provide any evidence for that. And they recently actually were even investing in the, in the mine. And then actually what kind of really, kind of made the cake here was Heckler, the president, the CEO, we have this was at their stakeholder meeting. We have very low costs of production in both silver and gold and plan to keep using our cash flow to fund the expanded exploration program and look for potential acquisitions. We are in the best position ever for long-term growth. Well, that kind of undermined their rationale that they were going to close. So that variance was disapproved, actually. And then this was just, this happened 2003, I think. So about 10 years later, I was just wondering, how they were doing. So this was, when I pulled this up, this was on their website, their annual, some of their annual stockholder material here. And, they talk about, all this wonderful, how great they're doing here. And records, they're meeting all these records here. So obviously, we made the right call. I mean, they didn't need the variance and they didn't get it. So that's it. So I'm happy to answer any more questions. I'm going to be around. I guess we have a break now. Is that right? No? Okay, well, we're going right to the... I'll be around for the rest of the day. So, okay. Do I have time for one more question? People are raising their hand? No questions. Okay, all right.
Do the costs factor in ecosystem services or potential medical costs for the
For what?
pollution going untreated?
I'm sorry, say that again, I couldn't hear you.
Do the costs factor in any way ecosystem services or potential medical costs for folks that are affected by the pollution?
There's no reason not to include those, to expand the scope of the analysis. This is basically, what I'm showing here is kind of like, what is the minimum necessary, the minimum kind of analysis necessary to meet the requirement of the regulation. I think that, more expansive, analysis with, looking into potential impacts that we didn't look here would certainly no reason not to include that.